Good evening, everyone. I am Soumi Bandyopadhyay, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Center of South Asian Studies, University of Hawaii. Under this theme, TMYS review March 2023 will explore the role of community appearance and individual presentation in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submission of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is religion persecution and women's personal space, the practice and impact of covering women's face under various religious faiths. We are honored to have with us Professor Rajagopalan, Radhakrishnan, Professor Jyoti Atwal, and Professor Sweta. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Dr. Rajagopalan Radhakrishnan. Dr. Rajagopalan Radhakrishnan is Distinguished Professor of English, Comparative Literature, African American Studies at the University of California, where he is also affiliated with the Department of Gender and Sexualities and the program in Global Culture. He is the author of numerous articles and essays published in academic journals and edited collections. He is also a poet both in English and Tamil and translator into English of contemporary Tamil fiction. He has also guest edited special issues of journals such as the Massachusetts Review, Modern Fiction Studies, the Journal of Contemporary Thoughts, and South Asian Review. Member of wide range of editorial boards and review committees, he is the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a distinguished award for scholarship and teaching from the South Asian Literary Association, and several others. Next, we have Professor Jyoti Atwal. She is the associate professor at Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And she is also adjunct professor at Department of History, Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Limerick, Ireland. She specializes in gender study and gender history of India in the colonial and post-colonial context. Her recent publications include an edited volume on gender and violence in historical and contemporary perspective, situating India. She has authored Real and Imagined Widows, Gender Relations in Colonial North India. She has been a visiting fellow at various universities across the globe. She is on editorial boards of Women History Review. Next, we have Sweta. Sweta is currently engaged as an assistant professor of English at Khairan-Nesha Begum Women's College, Karimganj, Assam. She has earned her master's degree in English from Tezpur University and MPhil in English from Woodland University. Her research interests include Indian writings in English, transnational migration studies, cultural studies, and she has, to her credit, several poems which are being published in many of the e-journals, print journals, as well as anthologies. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. First, I would like to request Professor Rajagopalan Radhakrishnan sir, please present your views on today's topic. And I would also like to request professors to please mute your mics while one is speaking. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Namaste ji. Absolutely delighted and honored to be here. Swami ji, thank you for inviting me in this distinguished panel. Honored to be on the panel with Sweta ji and Jyoti ji. Also thrilled that it has a connection with the South Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii, where I have my dear friend, Professor Shankar, whom I've known for a long, long time, and he's in that department. So I'm deeply honored. So also want to acknowledge the fact, my role as a gendered male, but a feminized male, a feminist by persuasion, and what that means. And to anticipate maybe discussions like the relationship between who is saying something and what is being said, the limits of representation, and in particular, the connection between identity politics and the politics of representation. So that would be the broad framing. But as I begin, just a few thoughts, and again, with much gratitude to all I have learned all my life from various branches of feminist thinking and thought and the women in my life. But one is situated right away in the context of religion, considering what is happening right now in Iran and the protests all over the world in the name of Masa Amini, Nika Shakarami, Sarina Ismail Zadeh, to keep those in mind. Want to pose a few questions which I want to share with you. The first question is why this connection, this natural connection between religion and woman? What do we make of that connection? In other words, in this whole debate, why is a woman being marked in a certain way, whereas the male remains unmarked? To be marked would mean to be rendered finite, to be rendered vulnerable to essentialism. To be unmarked is to be kind of universal in general. So that is a question I would like to ask. So immediately when you say religion, why is it natural to invoke woman along with religion? So the question they want to ask based on that is, what is nature in general? What is human nature? What is religious nature? What is secular nature? So the whole idea of double coding the word nature on the one hand, as if it were something unchangeable, primordial, which we cannot mess with. That is how things are. Aisa hi hai, prakritik reality, aisa hi hai, versus nature as in produced nature under ideological conditions, specific regimes, nature under autocracy, nature under capitalism, nature under socialist feminism. This peculiar ambivalence of nature, on the one hand, invoked as something which is prior to human construction, but on the other hand, nature itself, within quotation marks, as something which you produce ideologically, intentionally, as a mode of production. And how this word nature falls differentially on constituencies such as male, female, working class, gender, cisgender, transgender. And also, I think it's important because it also has to do with various forms of authority. When you're asked to do certain things, when we obey nature, we obey the state, obey the classroom, obey, a certain manifesto, the different kinds of interpellation, subject formation, along with these possibilities of resistance and revolt. So that's something I would like to get into at some point. I can't wait to listen to my other speakers. In particular, the way in which the woman question gets caught up between religion and the secular, belief and knowledge. Along with that, if we invoke religion, what kind of authority are we invoking? Is such an authority humanly constructed? Is it primordial? Who speaks in religion? God himself or herself, or the prophets, or the priests, or the ayatollahs? And if that is indeed the case, what are the possibilities of resisting such an authority? So that is a broader question of different forms of authority: the state, the family, the individual, our bodies, and religion. All of them kind of construct us in certain ways, and then we kind of perform in ways in which these authorities allow us to perform, and then raise the question of, can we go against it? And if we go against it, will we be persecuted? Will we be killed? Will we be ostracized? Will we be exiled? And things of that sort. In all of this, what I'm trying to focus on, what I think from my point of view is most important, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And here, of course, I go back to the fantastic work of the dear friend of mine, Lata Mani's work on sati. The important question is, what is, woman's agency? The whole question of agency, and how do you locate agency? When do you really feel like you have agency and you have choice? And to what extent is choice really free? And to what extent is choice itself a kind of givenness? Some people feel trapped by choice, and other people feel choice liberates them. And other people are so free that they don't even choose. They walk through life like knife through butter. They don't even think about it. They are who they are. They breathe freely. They think freely. They do freely. The whole notion of choice to them seems completely redundant and gratuitous because they are so free that they don't even know that they are free. And then when you say choice, choice is always a peculiar intermingling of some things which are determined and deterministic, and other things which are, and I think one of the questions talks about that. How do you find your own space? Do you find your own space and create it on your own? Or do you somehow, within the givenness of a prison or the givenness of a regime, you try to squeak in a little niche which you call your own, but not really your own, but extremely entrenched, besieged, and always in a state of precarity? So that's a question that I would like to raise. So along with what is agency, and how do you identify different forms of agency, and then decide which forms of agency are completely burdened and which forms are truly free. And the same question with to connect agency with the whole question of what does a woman want, or to put it more precisely, what do women want? And underneath that question, be able to accommodate all kinds of hybridity multiplicity, plurality, heterogeneity, rather than use the category as a kind of a monolithic category, and deny freedom of choice, either in the name of ideological rectitude or religious purity. So that is something that I would like to talk about. And two particular traps, it seems to me, that in general, women have been subject to is, on the one hand, the trap of essentialism, to say, as a kind of an a priori, almost as a matter of belief, women in home, women in tradition, women in interiority, they go hand in hand together, as if this were God's own truth, as if this were a fundamental ontological orientation, whereas man has a different. So there is always the problem of, one is essentialization, which kind of dehistoricizes you and traps you, but while seeming to honor you. So even if you were to say home is a woman's territory, who says so? Is it a choice that women themselves made, or was it a choice given to them as a kind of an ideological done deal? Asahi Hoga, as a kind of a fait accompli, but whatever the systems may be, patriarchy possibly. The other thing that I'm interested in is, how do you identify, which is true for any cause, the woman question, the worker question, the Jewish question, the Palestinian question. Each of these causes is in some sense autonomous each in itself. So in that sense, the woman question, but at the same time, in the world of actuality, these autonomous issues, or whatever a cause may be, are always in a relationship of a conjunctural relationship, in a relationship of what we now know as intersectionality. It is not just a woman, which woman, transgender woman, Hindu woman, Islamic woman, ascetic woman, atheistic woman, agnostic woman. So when that happens, then it really becomes a question of, how do you find who you are within the intersectionality? On the one hand, honor the legitimacy of being intersectional, without at the same time being either deracinated by, or diluted by, or depoliticized by being in the intersection. To put it very simply, and I'm not saying anything really new or anything, to be simultaneously to say I'm Islamic and I'm a woman, and I'm, if you are in a situation of that kind, which cause, and people, there've been debates about that, Ghar and Bahar and Tagore, Partha Chatterjee's work on home and away, interiority, etc. How do you kind of realize this solidarity, this coalitional positioning in a kind of a non-hegemonic way? If you said, and I'm thinking of Fanon, is a text that I teach all the time, Fanon and Algeria being unveiled, uh, you know, uh, and here again, in that situation, woman gets instrumentalized on the one hand, both by the nativist as well as by the colonizer. So how do you kind of retain a kind of an independent positionality without disavowing your connection with the other formations? So if you were to say Islamic woman, so is Islam already, or Hindu woman? Do we have to worry about, again, I'm referring to Lata Mani's work. I would suggest that the issue is not to worry about what Manu said, or what Jesus said, or Muhammad said, and trying to find a tradition. And this tradition is the true tradition, and we need to read it through that. But much rather in the opposite direction, given all of these traditions, what do actual women want? And this may mean breaking traditions in different directions, or holding on to them in certain ways, abandoning them in other ways. So the real question is, between these two horizons, is Islam, or is religion, the primary horizon? This is something I would like to come back to. What is indeed a primordial horizon, which we are somehow honored to accept? And then come a series of historical regimes which are changeable. So, what is changeable and what is seemingly unchangeable? Or I would like to say there is nothing called the unchangeable, except we made something unchangeable by making it, by naturalizing it. So if somebody said, okay, I want to be a free woman, and then within Islam or within Hinduism or within, so how do we manage the tension between these? One seems to be a macro horizon, and the other seems to be a micro horizon. But the real question is, if does any one horizon have the right to establish the initial rule and then insist that what has to come after the second, the third, and the fourth have an obligation to be in synchronicity with the first? Or do we say these are all dispersions? And even the so called first horizon itself is not really the first, it was made the first. It might well be the other way around. It might well be what really matters is the woman question, and Islam gets subsumed under the woman question rather than the other way around. Okay, so that is something I would like to get into, and that is I think I'm running out of time, um, and we can link it to um, uh, yeah. The final thing I want to talk about is different kinds of sanctions. In all of this, what is a cultural sanction? What is a religious sanction? Who are the insiders to? And in particular, maybe I'll leave off with that, the production of consent from a particular group. What makes this particular group say that if somebody says wear a veil or wear a parda or do a certain kind of things, how is it presented to me? And how do I, consent to it? Is the consent really my own, or is the consent seemingly my own, but in fact it's already ideologically prefigured in ways in which I cannot? It becomes a kind of what Saidiya Hartman calls a burden, kind of freedom. So in all of this, it seems to me, what matters is, from a particular point of view, and to be able to do your own politics, and at the same time be part of a larger transformation, which you might want to call coalitional or intersectional, but absolutely make sure that in the process that your wants and desires do not get homogenized, are not made to seem like a homolithic, monolithic whole, or in some sense be ruthlessly instrumentalized in the name of the nation or in the name of something else, and you become secondary to your own needs. So ultimately, what does it all mean to me? It's a way of saying, how can any particular movement or constituency be true to itself in terms of all its internal multiplicity and heterogeneity exist, and at the same time find a way to coexist with other causes in a very porous way, in a way that really allows for formation of coalitions, but in a way that is non-punitive and non-hegemonic, which is ultimately a way of saying, I'll close with that, to find a way of reconciling meaningfully what people we've been calling in academia identity politics, where politics seems to inhere in a certain body, our bodies ourselves, and on the other hand, a politics of representation, which opens up a broader space where movements can be made, transcending even body space, without having to uh, uh, axiomatize one particular anchor as the only anchor from which politics can be developed and elaborated. So with that, I stop. Thank you so very much. I'm grateful, and I hope I have contributed something. And I can't wait to hear from the other panelists. Take notes and learn. Thank you very much. बहुत शुक्रिया बड़ी मेहरबानी.
Thank you so much, sir. And now I would like to request Professor Jyoti Atwal, ma'am, please present your views on today's topic. And over to you, ma'am.
Um, Very good evening to everyone. And I'm very honored and pleased to be invited by Coral again. And thank you, Shomi, for coordinating it. And also, a really interesting note at which Professor Radhakrishnan began. And I think it sets the tone for the discussion to happen. So thank you very much. Am I audible properly? I'm sorry, just a little worried about the connection. Uh,
Yes, ma'am.
Show me.
You are.
Okay, all right,
Yes,
great,
ma'am.
thank you. I think many questions have been posed, and many aspects of women and religion have been pointed out by uh, Professor Radhakrishnan. So, but I'd like to take on from there as a historian. It's my main training of being a historian. Um, I'll make that handy. Um, we're First of all, let me clarify that we are not discussing spiritual women, where that is one thing which is partly voluntary to become a spiritual woman, acquire spirituality of different kinds, and there's certain freedom in where you want to acquire it from. We're talking about institutional religion, institutionalization, and that is the question that I'm going to be addressing, and also I'm going to be pointing out to some of the historical points, because we are living in an amazing period when one part of the world is fighting for uh, against hijab and the other fighting for hijab. So it's amazing. So what sense do we make of tradition and religion? That is again a big question in the present times, and I think we need to rethink that with a feminist lens. That's what I'm primarily going to do today. So given that fact, I think there are two important views that have come out from the studies in the past, which are, very important for us as academics and for activists also to know, that religion has been understood as a liberatory force for many women, and historically in the past as well. We have looked at, uh, mendicants, women poets from the South, saint poets from the South, and I can list so many. One being the fantastic work of my own colleague, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, Professor Vijaya Ramaswamy, who had worked on Mahadevi Yakka, and she had looked at how this lady was, you know, uh, the freedom she had of going around and learning, and also give lecturing and creating poetry. So it is this kind of freedom that has been highlighted by some historians, which existed as far as historical context is concerned. But of course, we do have the question of tradition at the center of this, as to what would be the textual position, because this is a non-textual position that we know, the more practiced form of religion, where women can become saints, women can become mendicants, women can live the way they want to. So this is a 12th century example that I just gave. But as we move on to more bhakti and Sufi, towards bhakti and Sufi medieval period, we also have another liberatory force, which is the bhakti movement in the form of saints, Mirabai, and we hail her example. Of course, there is a lot of feminist rethinking and disagreeability regarding whether she would be treated as a feminist. Well, that's a question we can ask. Yes. Uh, that is a question we can ask even today. That's a question we can ask even. That question is valid for the past as well. Um, and the other school which exists thinks completely differently, that religion has stopped women's empowerment, that religion has blocked women's empowerment. Well, we know the work of Gabriel Dietrich here, and she's somebody who pointed out to certain aspects of patriarchy as early as 1986 with her book, which came out in 1990s, and her grounded work in the field is still very, very relevant. So there are some of the the expanding horizons of looking at religion and women in that sense. But historically, when we come to the more modern period, or the colonial period, that is where the 19th century Renaissance question comes in, and I think that is the most interesting period, where women's religion and women, religious reform, social reform, became dependent on each other, and that is where we see a certain kind of interconnectedness of the two. They became so directly connected with the question of modernity, and universality of religion also became a question of women's acceptability of women's entry into education, into different spaces of public interest, of public space, political public space particularly. And here we know the work of, we know that Gandhi had a very well it was not a traditional position. It was conservative in many ways, that he imagined women in the public space. And I think he also talked about sati being very the sati hood being very preferable. Now, what he meant by sati, he had to clarify. What did he mean? Did he mean return to the system of sati? So he explained, no, it wasn't meant to be that. So it is this interpretation of tradition. I think that is very important with this 19th century opening up of possibilities and modernity. Vivekananda's dialogue with West was very important in this sense, that he modernized Hinduism, that it was not to be the same Hinduism that could not reach out to the world, that was distinct from the rest of the world. It had to somewhere enmesh with other values of the world. And 19th century, as we all know, was a century when all kinds of experiments were taking place. And in the late 19th century, the idea that religion was going to free women from sexuality was very strong, and also that sexuality was a right in same at the same time. So it's very interesting how sexuality is inbuilt into the question of women, and of course the other question of protest and rebel and non-conformism comes becomes very important. Here I'll point out to Coral's uh, fantastic work on Draupadi and how she tries to project a dialogue that is happening with when she's getting married to the five brothers, and what are her feelings. So this Mahabharata from the perspective of Draupadi is such a fantastic idea. So I think these are the kind of feminist openings that we have at present. I mean, of course, this is from the partly fictional point of view, but nevertheless, it is important to look at feminist imaginations. So historically, we have two very feminist ideas. Both were feminist, and these were very contradictory to each other. One, Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. Okay, I'll just take 1 minute and wind up. Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, who nearly almost converted to Christianity and discarded her Brahmin self, um, was also could also be considered a feminist and a religious reformer. But also Rashundari Devi, who wanted to um, break all the laws, rules and codes of women's place in kitchen. She carried, she for the love of Bhagavad Gita, she carried the book. She learned how to read in the kitchen in the late 19th century. So it's interesting how these spaces are, how we look at these spaces through a feminist lens. Of course, the recent case of Sabarimala Shrine is very important. That's something which I have been asked to talk about. Sabarimala Shrine, of course, is another uh, moment in history when we saw activism and collectivism of women around this. They were not religious women. They were women who wanted their rights. So this connects us with the larger question of citizenship. And I think it's very important. So instead of putting away the question of religion and versus secular, I think it's more important to see religion also as a right and right to equality, which needs to be built in within the question of religion, especially for a country like India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, I would like to request Professor Sweta, uh, ma'am, to please present your views on today's topic, and over to you.
Thank you, Soumi. Am I audible, everyone? Yeah.
Yes, you are.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to share the space as a speaker with Radhakrishnan sir and Jyoti ma'am. I'm thankful to Coral ma'am for bringing me here. I'm thankful to Saurabh sir and also Soumi for beautifully conducting the session. And I have listening to sir and ma'am also, and I have taken notes. They have brilliantly spoke about things which are keeping in sync with today's theme. So lately, I was reading one text that is Tilotoma Mishra's Swarnalata, which was originally published in 1991. So it was written in Ohomia. Later on, it was translated into English by Udayan Mishra in 2011. So why I am talking about the text, because while I was reading the text, I just thought one question, the question that struck into my mind, that why she should suffer for believing in one faith. Basically, Tilotoma Mishra's Swarnalata blends. It's a blending facts and fiction. So it showcases the series of transition in Assam, led by the whirlwinds of Bengal Renaissance, Brahmo Samaj movement, the British colonial intervention, and how it cast a shadow on Assam. So I would like to bring the northeastern context, especially keeping in mind how the uh, climate had changed in Assam. So, with the advent of American Baptist missionaries in Assam, they came keeping in mind with the development of trade and commerce and uh, to develop the thing of tea industry. So they targeted at civilizing the natives, as well as enlightening them and introducing among them a new faith of Christianity. With them, a new group had emerged, that is Zenana Christian missionaries. What is Zenana? We all know that group of women. They, when they form a kind of society or a group, then it's a Indian word. So Zenana Christian missionary had was very prominent in Assam during the 19th century. So I would like to highlight the fictional characters, uh, Tora and Swarnalata. They they had converted into Christianity from Hinduism. They were the new uh, Assamese Christian. So how the society was hostile, how the society was kept pressurizing to live in an abandoned way, to live in an isolated way, and the society had cut off all the ties, all the social ties from them. Nobody was willing to marry. Even one information I got to know from the text, that Swarnalata was going to get married to Rabindranath Tagore, but because Rabindranath Tagore's family had so much fame, and when they came to know about Swarnalata, she was the daughter of Gunabhiram Borua. So Gunabhiram Borua, he was very famous at that time in Assam, and he was holding one official position. So when their family came to know that Swarnalata father had converted into Christian, and Swarnalata's father had uh, married twice, and they were believing in Christianity, and even Swarnalata was following Christianity. So they were not very willing to. uh, so they were not willing to take it forward, the marriage prospect with Swarnalata. So hence so we can see that how Torah, fictional characters like Torah as well as Swarnalata, how they were looked down in the society during 19th century, but they had the courage to take the faith and go on with their faith. The Sanskritic Hindu climate of Assam had started to be very hostile and unreceptive towards the American Baptist missionaries, and this had tempered their steady growth. They were growing, but this hostile environment had hampered their steady growth. So, keeping in sync with this fiction, we can see that persecution can be understood as the hostility or ill treatment, especially because of race or political or religious beliefs. Violation of freedom of religion or belief can affect any member of a minority religious community. Religious persecution is not gender blind. Women from different communities suffer from persecution based on religion. So there is a greater risk of abuses. Those abuses may have a very negative impact on their psyche. especially the women. I'm talking about the women and the Zenana, the emergence of Zenana Christian missionaries, which is not that much talked about. So Torah was also converted into Christian. She indulged into uh, mm, the services for the missionaries, as well as she indulged herself in the proselytization works. But she was condemned by the society. In one instance, I remember in the text, where she wanted to enter into the gates of non-Christian families. So from the gates they were they were kept. She was allowed to go back. So so this is the way that how societies were hostile, and women were persecuted on the basis of religion. In this way, we can say that women's autonomy or their rights, or their women rights, are being also violated. She became the sufferer for her own faith, because she believed in some faith, and but she did not get a positive environment, and hence she had to do this thing ekla cholore. So with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much. I hope I made some sense.
Thank you so much. And with this, now we move on to the question answer round of today's segment. So my first question is for Professor Rajagopalan sir. So women's autonomy has frequently been linked with women's opportunities and investments, such as education, employment, and reproductive control. The association between women's autonomy and religion in the developing world, however, has received less attention. And the few existing studies make comparisons across the major religious traditions. So, what do you think about it?
Oh, thank you again. Thank you, Sweta ji and Jyoti ji, for your speeches. I enjoyed them, took a lot of notes. Thank you so very much. Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't have a clear answer, but the whole question of what is the linkage and how do you choose what links are the best for you? Do you choose it as an individual or as a community? How do you form when a woman speaks? What is the hinterland behind her? And the whole question of divided loyalties, the difficulty of being able to parse your entire political vision within one spectrum. The corporate woman, in some sense, to be corporate is not a good thing. But who is to say that? To corporatize in general, men have done that already. And for a man to come and say that it happened in the case of, theory, when it said the voice is dead, representation is no more. So how can you say that now, just when we are beginning to voice ourselves? You can call the shots. So you have to be very careful in terms of what a linkage is. How many directions does it have to be? A single linkage? Can it be multiple linkages? In some senses, can I in some strategic way deal with the corporation without having to be completely corporate? So that's an interesting question. And I think Shweta ji, you raised that question. When you convert, when somebody says, for example, somebody like an Edward Said said that he would never be, he was my mentor, he said, I don't need to be a post-humanist, I'm going to be a non-humanist humanist. So when you can you be Brahminic in some ways, but not in other ways? Hindu in some ways, is that even permissible? Or do you have to say it has to be tooth court? The whole idea, for example, in the apartheid, we said there's nothing called a constructive engagement with apartheid. We just condemn it wholesale. So similarly with each tradition, given that each tradition, to use Walter Benjamin's definition, is equally a document of barbarism, how do you pick and choose? And again, on Jyoti ji's excellent presentation of history, people like Brahmo Samaj, Vivekananda in particular, negotiating with the modern. How do you evaluate it? Do you think of it as capitulating to the modern? The whole notion of the new woman, Pudumai Pen, that's a huge, movement happening in, for example, Surumani Bharati in South India. So then it becomes a question of you become Mishrit. You're not pure anymore. So I would leave it at that. So the whole question of linkages will have to be left free to individuals, depending on their situation. Because even within the most seemingly homogeneous community, there is always a difference within. Even if you said Dalit, even if you said took the smallest community, within that there is always difference, and you can dictate, which linkage is the right one to do. So that becomes eventually, a drama of divided loyalties, and how do you parse your situation. So at that particular point, my own suggestion is to avoid the temptation of the one and remain the many, and let the many, in some kind of a rhizomatic way, make all kinds of connections to destabilize any kind of hegemony wherever that might be, rather than to pick one and stay right there. Uh, Rather than rooting oneself, what the rhizome does is spreads in all kinds of unpredictable directions, and in doing that, I think you are in a better position to be engaging in multiple quarrels with multiple, formations. There are multiple temporalities. In some senses, you were battling with this. In some senses, you are with this. And that, I think, is important to kind of maintain that ambivalence in a kind of a positive way, rather than choose one particular paradigm and say, in the name of that one paradigm, I'm going to be resolving all the problems, because that, it seems to me, will just not work, if that makes sense. So in that sense, religion, as Jyoti ji pointed out, can be a tremendously, empowering, force. And in some senses, some great thinkers have, gone away from the politics to go back to the social, the individual, to create a kind of a second order change in politics itself. I mean, Tagore was doing it all along. The more important thing is social changes are more important than political changes. If you have political change not based on the social, that change is absolutely cosmetic and superficial. So in that sense, you retreat from the political to make it more powerful. But ultimately, it has to be. I'll come back to the whole notion of what is free and what is the choice, and when is choice itself the ultimate kind of bondage. I hope I, in some sense, addressed your question, but thank you for that profound question. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir. And with this, now we will move on to Professor Jyoti ma'am. And my question for you: men and women may have distinct experiences when it comes to such phenomena as religious violence or religious persecutions or religious oppressions. And more specifically, their inability to dialogue results in theoretical or conceptual or statistical ambiguity, as it obscures important differences that likely exist between gendered violence targeted against their religious minorities and religiously motivated violence, and also targeted at women and people identifying as lesbian or gay or bisexual, transgender, or queer. Furthermore, in most cases, women found negotiating spaces rather than creating spaces for themselves. And most of these activities were done undercover. So, what do you think? How these spaces should be should be created for the women to express their ecclesiastical spirituality? Over to you, ma'am.
You need to unmute. I can't hear.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I forgot I was muted. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chomi. That was a rather a long question. Just wanted to say that um, it depends on how that has been politically represented to women. The whole question of tradition and so on, because the tradition itself has been, always gets recast in in different times. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar took out a tradition which didn't exist. He took out Parashar Shamhitas and Narad Sharmitas to prove that widows could remarry. And then the same Samhitas were contradicted by his enemies, opponents, who said, no, can't be. So, what is tradition is a question. But the use of tradition is always a political idea. That idea needs to be captured, and also how women will resist that is how women are equipped to deal with that. For example, if you're educating women, if you're making them conscious, if you're making them aware of oppression, violence in the present day, then you will have women who will also question tradition. It and also develop a very different form of spirituality in contradistinction to that kind of oppression. They will develop their own politics, and that is what feminism is. I mean, feminism is not really, I mean, feminism is not only really political rights. Political rights are also the right to question a tradition, is a right, which needs to be embedded within the religion. That is the point I was making. It should come from within the religion, where religion can give you the right to also question a tradition. This is what happened in case of Mahadevi Akka, I just mentioned, and we have several other women. There were women, foreign women, who came and voluntarily uh, joined Ramakrishna Paramhansa's group or other groups, and also Josephine MacLeod, was very well known for that matter. So you have, this Calcutta group, which is pulling all the Western women, and Nivedita, Sister Nivedita is one example. Then so many, I mean, I can give you those examples. They were attracted to Hinduism, but the universalistic Hinduism. They were not attracted to the practice of Hinduism. It is the universality that attracted them. And I think that is something which we need to keep in mind, that these are also spaces in the 19th century. Right now, today we have a choice as citizens, whether to go to temple, whether to follow a certain religion, whether to follow a ritual. That needs to be kept intact. The right to choose. That is something, we need to see. These rights, or the tradition should not um, sweep over your rights. That is more important, to avoid the questions of oppression which you have raised, and persecution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we will move on to Professor Sweta, ma'am. So my question to you: Tego's family had Brahmo inclination since his father's times, and then why was their religion a problem? Do you have any document on this, or it remains just a story? So over to
Well,
you.
in this regard, thank you, Somi, for asking this question. Well, in this regard, I would like to say that I haven't come across any document regarding this statement. I just read in that story. And yeah, so Gunabhiram Borua's family, he was following Brahmo. He was follower of Brahma Samaj. But however, his daughter was actually inclined to Christianity. So I found it in the text. However, I do not have any evidence regarding this. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, sir, I have a second question for you. The role women play in the sustenance and continuation of many religious practices, particularly the pivotal role of women in the practices of religion in the no institutional domestic arena is also very important. And through this kind of development of concept of women's significant spaces, how these spaces are intimately connected to the contribution of women, the development of their expertise or the development of their communities. So
Okay.
over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you for that really meaningful question. I want to kind of piggyback of what Jyoti ji said, the distinction between the institutional and the personal. In most of these situations, both with reference to the women's movement, which I cannot speak for, but in general, for any kind of a Dalit, subaltern, minority context, to reject the seduction of a single path and multiple strategies, which is always painful and discontinuous. On the one hand, there used to be a generation, I was part of that generation. We used to say things like, on the one hand, do identity politics, but at the same time, question identity with a capital I. So, on the one hand, institutionalization is important, but don't fetishize it. So that is required for certain reasons. So a kind of a mobile strategy where you have the ability to read the same phenomenon situationally in many different dialects, in many different voices. I mean, there's an undercurrent. So in the context of, what do we do with the corporation institution? That's one. The other connection that I wanted to make is, again, the important point that Jyoti ji made about Hinduism being universalistic. So when you become universal, in some sense, it takes you beyond yourself. I mean, every religion is simultaneously both particular and universal. Which universal? the Muslim Islamic universal or the Hindu universal, which becomes a kind of you begin to beg the very question of universality. But the interesting issue, it seems to me, in those sorts of issues, which I think connects to your earlier question, is you begin with an intention which is seemingly pure, quote unquote. But when your other worlds come into you, you think of kaun videshi, kaun pardeshi, kaun who's indigenous. Is this foreign to me? If it's foreign to me, like my generation of people born right after India's independence, on the one hand, we took to the streets to protest against the imposition of English as the lingua franca. But at the same time, we loved English as a language. Is that a contradiction? So when you want to become universal, in some sense, you go beyond yourself, and then you have to choose, like, well, and this reform Vivekananda is coming from a source beyond yourself. It is non-indigenous. So in being universal, do you have to be someone who is purely universal, or does it have to be mixed in certain ways? So it seems to me, so I leave it at that. So it depends on how you define your objectives. On the one hand, the objective should lead you to your path in a direct way, and that is the ideal situation. But on your path, you meet with other people, other passengers, other fellow travelers, and then you say, hey, is this person insider or an outsider? Indigenous or non-indigenous? And the whole question of it may not be indigenous to begin with, but I've made it my own through an act of agency. So I leave it at that. So to answer your question, I think all of these arenas could be potential allies, but it depends on, are they intrinsically that? So often great thinkers have always pointed out the limitation of politics as such. There are many other registers. So why are we giving politics the hegemonic control over all of life? So in that sense, you need to kind of come back to it. So the real question then is, often we don't have the right to choose your own sites. The sites are given to you. But the question is, by entering those sites, what changes can I make, rather than commit yourself to a single ideological path? So that would be my rough response to you. Again, thank you for the question. Again, I hope I made some sense.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Now I have a second question for Jyoti ma'am. We can see how religious women meaningfully navigate with menstrual practices and the restrictions to draw attention to the ways religiously motivated menstrual practices create gendered roles and expectations and channels women's sexuality for specific reproductive purposes. Ma'am, just enlighten the various strategies to combat the religious communities and cultures that defines the menstruation-related myths prevalent in India and their impact on women's lives. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Shomi. The question of menstrual practice, it is not as if the question belongs to the domain of only religious women. Somehow, I think it belongs more to the domain of uh, Indian women generally, because as we all know, there are still parts of India where, since I teach in a university where I get students from all over India, and I'm so happy that I get all of them. There's such diverse crowd that I teach, rather than a homogeneous crowd. That would be boring. So there are lots of myths and superstitions that the students come with. The younger generation also believes in many things like seclusion during menstruation, or if you touch tulsi, the tulsi will die. All those things. I mean, nothing is demonstrable. Nothing has been demonstrated. One has to really scientifically see how these how these superstitions are not facts. They're just the faith, and there's a difference between faith and reason. So we slowly somehow try to teach them that. But as a strategy, I think again we are talking about everyday feminisms. Women, when you give them opportunity to learn more, expose themselves to something more, they will find ways to combat these everyday oppressions. And first of all, it is not a ritual, it's an oppression. When have you, and also recognize those areas of oppression. Okay, for example, when we say sati, the practice of sati, which was the most cruel most practice that could ever be in the 19th century or ever be in India, there was an end to it. And the end was not so difficult as the missionaries and the British and the colonial state thought it would be very difficult. Really, it wasn't that difficult, because once people collectively, they knew that they were doing something wrong. There was a lot of pressure that was built from inside the society. So these strategies are multi-layered, and women themselves, of course, there's a lot of I would again relook at I would ask everybody to, I mean, those who are interested in the question, to look at Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, because I think there is a lot of, within the text and colonial records, the subaltern is speaking. It's our question, that how up to us what our strategy of approaching the text is. Okay, so I found some records where it was possible to access women's voices and what they were saying within the colonial records. Okay, so strategies are there. It's a very good question about strategies. I think it's everyday strategies, of resistance, which are so important. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. My second question for Sweta ma'am is would you consider women persecution on the basis of religion is parallel to the violation of women's autonomy? So, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Somi, for asking me the second question. And I would like to say that, as Jyoti ma'am said, that if women are exposed to education, then they will be able to combat with the daily oppression. So if they are educated, if they know that as clothing or as food or as to breathe, these are basic rights. So to believe in such certain faith is also one particular right. And if a woman chooses to believe in something, to follow any ritual, to follow any religion, so I believe that it is her basic right. And definitely women persecution, as you asked, that women persecution on the basis of religion is obviously parallel to the violation of women's autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, with this, we now come to the end of today's session. I would also once again like to say that we are calling for submission of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Rajagopalan Radhakrishnan sir, Professor Jyoti Atwal ma'am, and Professor Sweta Shur ma'am for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank
It's a
you very
Thank